The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport's private aviation terminal. The air buzzed with the usual symphony of distant jet engines and ground crew communications. At exactly 7:30 a.m., a sleek black Tesla Model X pulled up to the terminal's entrance. From the driver's seat emerged a man who didn't fit the typical private jet passenger stereotype. He wore a simple pair of dark blue jeans, a well-worn black t-shirt, and carried a weathered leather backpack that had clearly accompanied him on countless business trips. His watch, though worth more than most cars, blended seamlessly with his understated appearance. As the owner of 3 successful tech companies and with a net worth exceeding $3 billion, he could have easily draped himself in designer labels and flashy accessories. Instead, he believed in letting his work speak louder than his appearance. His employees often joked that he dressed more like someone who worked in its support than a tech mogul. Walking through the terminal, he nodded warmly at the cleaning staff, exchanged pleasantries with the security guard, and even stopped to help a fellow traveler pick up some dropped documents. These small gestures were second nature to him, having grown up in a household where his parents taught him that true character shows in how you treat everyone, not just those who can do something for you. His phone buzzed with messages about the upcoming board meeting in New York, where he would be presenting his company's latest innovation, a revolutionary virtual reality platform designed to transform corporate training programs. The project was especially close to his heart because it aimed to break down barriers and challenge unconscious biases in the workplace. As he approached the terminal's private jet section, he double-checked his flight details on his phone. The charter company had confirmed everything the previous evening, and his assistant had already sent ahead his preferred in-flight meal, a simple grilled chicken sandwich and green tea. Despite his immense wealth, he maintained these humble preferences, remembering the days when he could barely afford ramen noodles while building his first startup. The morning breeze carried the scent of jet fuel and freshly brewed coffee from the terminal's cafe. He paused briefly to take in the view of the various private jets lined up on the tarmac, their polished surfaces gleaming in the early morning light. His chartered jet, a mid-size Cessna Citation, waited at the far end of the row. Even in his choice of aircraft, he opted for practical efficiency over showy luxury. Walking toward his designated aircraft, he reflected on his journey from a small apartment in Atlanta to becoming one of the country's most successful tech entrepreneurs. He'd faced countless obstacles and closed doors along the way, but each challenge had only strengthened his resolve to succeed while staying true to his values. Little did he know that in the next few minutes, he would face a situation that would test these values and ultimately lead to an unexpected opportunity to create meaningful change in an industry that desperately needed it. His morning was about to become much more interesting than the routine flight he had planned, and his response would show that sometimes the most powerful way to address discrimination isn't through confrontation, but through education and understanding. As the tech billionaire approached his chartered jet, a flight attendant standing at the bottom of the aircraft stairs caught sight of him. She had only been working with a private aviation company for 3 months, and like many newcomers to the industry, she had certain preconceptions about what their typical clients looked like. She quickly stepped forward, positioning herself directly in his path. Her perfectly pressed uniform and rigid posture created an unmistakable barrier. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice carrying a tone that managed to make "sir" sound less like respect and more like an accusation. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel and confirmed passengers only." The businessman stopped, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the immediate recognition of what was happening. He'd been in similar situations before. High-end stores, exclusive restaurants, even his own company's lobby once, before he became well-known in the tech world. He reached for his phone to pull up his flight documentation. "I understand," he replied pleasantly. "I'm actually the client for this flight. Let me show you my credentials." But before he could open his digital documents, the flight attendant took a step closer, her hand raised in a stopping motion. "I'm quite familiar with all our clients," she interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. "And I can assure you that you must be lost. The main terminal is in that direction." She pointed toward the public area of the airport, speaking slowly as if addressing someone who might have trouble understanding basic directions. The businessman took a deep breath, his hand still holding his phone. Years of business negotiations had taught him that losing your cool never leads to positive outcomes. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice steady and professional. "If you could just check your passenger manifest." "Sir," she cut him off again, this time reaching for her radio. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll have no choice but to call security. This is a private aviation area, and we take our clients' safety very seriously." The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. Several ground crew members who had been preparing the aircraft began to exchange uncomfortable glances. One of them, who had worked at the terminal for years and recognized the businessman from previous flights, started walking toward the growing tension, but then stopped as he saw another figure hurrying across the tarmac. The businessman's personal assistant was speed walking from the terminal building, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that mixed concern with barely contained anger. She had been delayed at security due to a routine check of her laptop, and now she could see the situation unfolding before her. The flight attendant's body language shifted slightly as she noticed others approaching, but she maintained her blocking position. She dealt with what she considered unauthorized people trying to access private jets before, and she prided herself on what she saw as maintaining high standards for their exclusive clientele. Just behind the assistant, the pilot emerged from the terminal, having completed his final flight plan. He immediately recognized his passenger from the profile photos included in every flight brief. His face fell as he realized what was transpiring at the foot of his aircraft. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, its warmth doing nothing to thaw the cold confrontation playing out on the tarmac. In moments, everything would change, not just for the flight attendant who had made assumptions based on appearances, but for an entire company that would be forced to face its unconscious biases head-on. The businessman stood there, still holding his phone, watching as the situation was about to shift dramatically. Despite the humiliation and frustration of the moment, his mind was already working on how to turn this unfortunate incident into an opportunity for positive change, something he had become quite good at over his years in business. The tension at the foot of the private jet was suddenly broken by the pilot's warm, booming voice. "Good morning, sir. I apologize for any confusion," he called out as he approached. "I see you've arrived early for our flight to New York." The pilot extended his hand to the businessman, who shook it with a grateful smile. The flight attendant's expression shifted from stern authority to dawning realization. The color drained from her face as she watched the pilot, her direct supervisor, greeting the very man she had just threatened with security. Her hands, which had been so confidently placed on her hips moments ago, dropped limply to her sides. The personal assistant arrived at the scene, slightly out of breath from her quick walk across the tarmac. "I'm so sorry I'm late," she said to her boss, then turned to face the flight attendant. "I see you've met our client." Her tone was professional, but carried an edge that made the flight attendant take a small step backward. The ground crew, who had been watching the scene unfold, now busied themselves with their duties, though their quick glances told the story of their discomfort with what they had witnessed. One crew member accidentally dropped a clipboard, the clatter seeming especially loud in the awkward silence that had fallen over the group. The businessman watched as the flight attendant's professional demeanor crumbled. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a trembling lower lip and rapidly blinking eyes. He'd seen this transformation before, the moment when someone realized they'd made a terrible mistake based on their own prejudices. Rather than feeling satisfaction at her discomfort, he felt a familiar sadness at how common these situations still were. "Sir, I didn't," the flight attendant stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the red flush creeping up her neck and into her cheeks. Her eyes darted between the pilot, the assistant, and the ground crew, searching for some way to undo the last 5 minutes. The pilot, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped forward. "Sir, please accept our sincerest apologies. This is completely unacceptable and doesn't reflect our company's values." He shot a meaningful look at the flight attendant, who seemed to be shrinking into herself with each passing second. The businessman raised his hand gently, stopping the cascade of apologies. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "this might be a good time for a conversation with management." His voice wasn't angry or threatening. If anything, it carried a note of purpose, as if he just identified an opportunity rather than suffered an insult. Several other crew members had gathered nearby, pretending to check equipment while actually watching the scene unfold. They'd all undergone basic training about bias and discrimination, sat through the required workshops, and signed the necessary papers. But watching this real-world situation play out was more impactful than any training video they'd ever seen. The personal assistant was already on her phone, speaking quietly but firmly with the aviation company's management. The flight attendant stood rooted to the spot, her earlier authority replaced by the sickening realization that she had just discriminated against one of the company's most valuable clients, and more importantly, had revealed her own biases in front of everyone. The morning sun now felt uncomfortably warm on the tarmac as they waited for management to arrive. The businessman loosened his collar slightly and pulled out his phone, calmly sending a few text messages. His composed behavior in the face of such blatant discrimination made the situation even more poignant for everyone watching. The gentle whine of aircraft engines and distant radio chatter filled the awkward silence. In just a few minutes, company executives would arrive, expecting to handle a crisis. But they would instead find themselves part of a turning point, not just for their company, but for an entire industry that needed to take a hard look at its ingrained biases and assumptions. Rather than letting anger take over, the businessman maintained his characteristic calm as he watched two company executives hurrying across the tarmac. He'd learned long ago that the loudest voice wasn't always the most effective one. Instead of demanding immediate punishment, he was already thinking about how to turn this uncomfortable moment into meaningful change. "Let's move this conversation inside," he suggested, gesturing toward the private terminal's conference room. His voice remained steady and professional, though the slight tension in his shoulders revealed the emotional weight of the situation. The flight attendant looked relieved to be away from the prying eyes of her colleagues, though she knew the worst was yet to come. Inside the sleek conference room, with its wall of windows overlooking the runway, the regional director wiped sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Sir, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for this incident," he began, his words tumbling out quickly. "I assure you, this kind of behavior does not reflect our company's values." The businessman sat quietly for a moment, his fingers lightly drumming on the polished conference table. The room fell silent, waiting for his response. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone present. "Tell me about your company's current training programs," he said. "Specifically, how do you address unconscious bias?" The executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. The head of operations cleared her throat before responding. "We have mandatory diversity training sessions twice a year," she explained. "Though I must admit, attendance has been inconsistent." She glanced briefly at the flight attendant, who seemed to shrink further into her chair. The businessman nodded thoughtfully, then reached for his leather backpack. He pulled out his tablet and pulled up a presentation he'd been planning to show in New York. "I'd like to show you something," he said, his voice taking on an encouraging tone that made everyone sit up a little straighter. As he connected his tablet to the room's display screen, he continued speaking. "My company has been developing something new. A virtual reality training program that doesn't just tell people about bias, it lets them experience it firsthand." The screen came to life with impressive graphics showing people wearing VR headsets, their expressions changing as they went through various scenarios. The flight attendant, who had been staring at her hands folded in her lap, looked up with unexpected interest. The businessman noticed this and directed his next words to her. "Would you be willing to try something different?" he asked, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to understand. Around the table, the tension began to shift. What had started as a crisis meeting was transforming into something else entirely. The regional director leaned forward, his earlier panic replaced by genuine curiosity. "You're not filing a formal complaint?" he asked cautiously. The businessman shook his head. "Filing complaints might satisfy anger in the moment, but it rarely creates lasting change," he explained. "I'm more interested in preventing the next incident than punishing this one." He paused, looking at each person in the room. "Though I do expect full commitment to whatever solution we develop here today." The flight attendant, who hadn't spoken since entering the room, finally found her voice. "I would like to learn," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "I never thought of myself as, I didn't realize I was." "We all have biases," the businessman gently interrupted. "The question is what we do once we recognize them." He turned back to his presentation, pulling up details about the virtual reality program. "This technology allows people to walk in someone else's shoes, to feel what it's like to be on the receiving end of assumptions and prejudice." Outside the conference room windows, planes continued to take off and land, their paths drawing invisible lines across the bright blue sky. Inside, a group of people who had started their morning as adversaries were beginning to see a path forward, one that might reach far beyond this single incident to touch countless lives in the aviation industry and beyond. The regional director shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he opened a folder on his laptop. "While we're being honest here," he began, his voice heavy with resignation, "I should acknowledge that we've had similar incidents before." The room grew notably quieter, even the distant sound of jet engines seeming to fade away. The head of operations closed her eyes briefly, knowing what was coming. The flight attendant looked up sharply, surprise crossing her face. She'd thought her mistake was a one-time occurrence, but now she was learning she was part of a larger pattern. 3 complaints in the past year, the director continued, scrolling through his files. All of them were classified as misunderstandings and handled with standard written warnings. He paused, looking genuinely troubled. "Looking back now, we should have seen the pattern forming." The businessman leaned forward, his attention caught by this revelation. "And what happened to those who filed the complaints?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The director's silence spoke volumes. "They took their business elsewhere," the head of operations admitted, her voice tight with regret. "We lost a major client last month. They switched to our competitor without explanation. Now I wonder if this was why." The flight attendant's face had grown increasingly pale as the conversation unfolded. "I had no idea," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "When I started here, everyone just told me to be extra careful about security, to make sure only real clients got through." The businessman raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly did they tell you a real client looks like?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Nobody wanted to answer, but everyone in the room knew exactly what had been implied in those informal training sessions. He pulled up another slide on his presentation, showing statistics about lost business opportunities due to unconscious bias. Companies lose billions each year, not just from direct discrimination cases, but from all the clients who quietly take their business elsewhere without ever filing a complaint. The head of operations reached for her tablet, quickly taking notes. "Our current training program clearly isn't enough," she admitted. "It's just PowerPoint presentations and multiple choice tests. People click through without really engaging with the material." The flight attendant spoke up, her voice stronger now. "That's true. I'll be honest. I skipped the last training session because I had a schedule conflict. Nobody seemed to mind. They just said I could catch up later." She paused, then added quietly, "I never did." The businessman nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly why we developed our VR program. It's not something you can just click through." He played a short video showing people reacting emotionally to the VR experiences. When you feel what it's like to be discriminated against, even in a virtual environment, it changes something in you. The regional director was rapidly typing on his laptop. Looking at our records now, I can see we've had a 40% drop in customer satisfaction scores among minority clients over the past year. How did we miss this? He shook his head, genuinely disturbed by the oversight. Outside the conference room, the regular bustle of airport activity continued, but inside, time seemed to slow as years of overlooked problems came to light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the conference table, like fingers pointing at issues that could no longer be ignored. "I'm willing to help," the businessman said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "But I need to know that everyone in this room is committed to real change, not just damage control." He looked at each person in turn, his gaze both challenging and encouraging. The flight attendant was the first to respond. "I want to be part of the solution," she said firmly, her earlier shame transforming into determination. "What happened today? It can't happen again. Not by me, not by anyone." The businessman stood up and walked to the window, watching a private jet take off into the clear blue sky. After a moment of reflection, he turned back to the group with purpose in his eyes. "Here's what I'm proposing," he said, returning to his seat at the conference table. "My company will provide our VR training program to your entire organization, at no cost." The regional director's eyes widened. He'd seen the price tag for cutting-edge VR training systems, and this offer was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "That's incredibly generous," he stammered, "but why would you do this?" "Because change has to start somewhere," the businessman replied, pulling up detailed specifications of the program on the screen. "And sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best opportunities." He glanced at the flight attendant, who was now sitting up straighter, her earlier shame replaced by attentive interest. The head of operations was already calculating the logistics. "We have over 300 employees across our locations," she said, quickly typing notes on her tablet. "How long would implementation take?" "We can have the first units here by the end of the week," the businessman replied. "But I have one condition." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "This can't be another optional training that people skip when they're busy. Every employee, from the CEO down to the newest hire, must complete the program." The flight attendant raised her hand slightly, like a student in class. Could I be the first to try it?" Her voice was steady now, carrying a note of determination that hadn't been there before. "I want to understand, really understand." The businessman smiled warmly. "That's exactly the kind of commitment we need." He turned to his personal assistant, who had been quietly taking notes. "Can you call the tech team and have them send over a demo unit this afternoon?" The regional director cleared his throat. "Sir, about your flight to New York," he began, clearly concerned about the delays this meeting had caused. The businessman waved his hand dismissively. "Some things are more important than keeping to a schedule. My board can wait an hour." He pulled up another slide showing the training program's success rates at other companies. "This isn't just sensitivity training," he explained. "The VR experience puts you in someone else's shoes. You'll feel what it's like to be dismissed, to be judged, to be treated as less than. But you'll also learn how to recognize your own biases and overcome them." The head of operations was already seeing the bigger picture. "We could make this part of our company's story," she said thoughtfully. "Not hiding from our mistakes, but showing how we're actively working to be better." "Exactly," the businessman nodded. "The aviation industry has a long history of exclusivity. Maybe it's time to change that narrative." He turned to the flight attendant again. "Sometimes the people who learn the hardest lessons become the best teachers." The flight attendant wiped a tear from her eye, but she was smiling now. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually grateful for this morning. Not for what I did," she added quickly, "but for where it's leading." The regional director stood up, extending his hand to the businessman. We accept your offer and your condition. Full participation, no exceptions. He turned to his team. Send out a company-wide notice. I want everyone to understand that this isn't just another training program. This is about who we want to be as a company. Outside, the morning had warmed into a beautiful day. Through the conference room windows, they could see ground crews preparing other private jets, clients arriving for their flights, and the normal bustle of airport life continuing. But for the people in that room, everything had changed. What had started as a crisis was transforming into an opportunity for real, lasting change. 1 week turned into 3 months. The private aviation company's main training room had been transformed into a VR learning center, with several stations set up for employees to experience the innovative program. The flight attendant who had sparked this change was now sitting in one of these stations, completing her final session. As she removed the VR headset, her eyes were damp with tears. This wasn't unusual. Many employees had similar emotional reactions to the training. Today's session had put her in the role of a successful business owner being repeatedly dismissed and disrespected simply because of how she looked. That was intense, she said to the training coordinator, who handed her a tissue. I've done all the sessions now, but this one really hit home. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I keep thinking about that morning, about how I made someone feel exactly like I just felt in there. The training room had become a busy place over the past months. Photos on the wall showed groups of employees engaging with the VR system, their expressions revealing moments of surprise, understanding, and often deep reflection. Below these photos hung a simple quote: "Change happens one person at a time." 2 other staff members were completing their sessions nearby. One, a veteran pilot, removed his headset with a thoughtful expression. 20 years I've been flying, he said quietly, and I never realized how many little things we do that can make people feel unwelcome. The company's internal surveys were showing remarkable changes. Employee feedback forms, previously filled with generic responses about good workplace culture, now contained thoughtful reflections on personal growth and understanding. The cleaning staff reported that for the first time, they felt truly seen and respected by everyone, not just a few kind souls. The flight attendant had become an unexpected advocate for the program. During break times, she would share her story openly with colleagues, not to shame herself, but to show how profound change was possible. I used to think I was just being careful about security, she would explain. Now I understand I was really just acting on assumptions I didn't even know I had. In the terminal, subtle but significant changes were visible. The way staff interacted with clients had shifted. Gone were the quick judgments based on appearance. Instead, there was a new atmosphere of respectful professionalism toward everyone who walked through their doors. The businessman's tech team had been monitoring the program's implementation closely. Their data showed that this location had one of the highest engagement rates they'd ever seen. Usually we see about 70% genuine participation, the lead technician reported. Here, it's over 95%. During a follow-up meeting, the head of operations shared some remarkable statistics. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped to 0. More surprisingly, their client base had grown more diverse, and customer satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. The flight attendant was now sitting in that same conference room where everything had changed 3 months ago. But this time, she was there to share her experience with executives from other aviation companies who were interested in implementing the program. The hardest part, she told them, her voice clear and confident, is admitting that we all have biases. The VR training doesn't just tell you what you're doing wrong. It helps you feel why it's wrong and shows you how to do better. She smiled at the memory of her own journey. It's not about shame or blame. It's about growth. Through the conference room windows, the same sky stretched above them, but the view somehow looked different now. The private aviation world, often seen as an exclusive club, was slowly transforming into something more inclusive, one changed perspective at a time. 3 months had passed since that fateful morning, and today was different. The flight attendant stood nervously in the private terminal, holding a small envelope. She had requested a meeting with a businessman who was returning through their terminal on another flight. This time, she wasn't wearing her uniform. She had come in on her day off specifically for this moment. The sleek private jet touched down right on schedule. As she watched it taxi to a stop, her hand tightened around the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter she had rewritten dozens of times, trying to find the perfect words to express how the past 3 months had changed her life. When the businessman descended the aircraft stairs, he looked exactly as he had that first morning: casual clothes, that same leather backpack. But this time, the flight attendant saw him completely differently. Not as an intruder to be stopped, but as a person who had turned a hurtful moment into an opportunity for growth. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said as they sat down in the terminal's quiet corner. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear and direct. "I know you're busy, but I needed to tell you something in person." The businessman set aside his phone, giving her his full attention. "Take your time," he said kindly, noticing her nervousness. Around them, the terminal continued its usual bustle, but this quiet corner felt like a world apart. "The VR training," she began, then paused to collect her thoughts. "It didn't just change how I do my job. It changed how I see the world." She opened the envelope and pulled out her letter. "I wrote everything down, but I'd like to tell you face to face too." She told him about her first VR session, how she had to stop halfway through because she was crying too hard. About experiencing what it felt like to be judged, dismissed, and discriminated against. About finally understanding the weight of her actions that morning. "But the most important change," she continued, her voice stronger now, "is what happened outside of work." She shared how she had started noticing her own biases in everyday life. At the grocery store, in her neighborhood, even with her own family members. The businessman listened intently, nodding occasionally. When she mentioned specific scenarios from the VR training, he smiled, recognizing the situations his team had carefully designed to create maximum impact. "Last week," she said, "I was at a restaurant with my friends. I overheard someone at the next table making assumptions about another customer, just like I used to do. For the first time in my life, I spoke up. I shared my story, told them about what I learned." She handed him the letter with slightly shaking hands. "I know an apology doesn't undo what happened that day. But I want you to know that your response to my mistake didn't just change me. It's creating a ripple effect." The businessman accepted the letter with a warm smile. "That's exactly what we hoped for," he replied. "Real change isn't just about policies and training programs. It's about people having the courage to look at themselves honestly and choose to be better." Through the terminal windows, they could see another private jet preparing for takeoff. The flight attendant watched it for a moment before turning back to him. "You know what's funny?" she said with a small laugh. "That morning, I thought I was protecting our high-value clients. I didn't realize I was facing one. Now I understand that every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect." The businessman stood up, offering his hand. "That's the most valuable lesson of all," he said, shaking her hand warmly. "And you've learned it so well that you're now teaching others." 6 months after that first confrontation at the airport, the private aviation company's story had spread throughout the industry. What started as a potential PR disaster had transformed into a case study in positive change. The company's training room, once a simple space with a few chairs and a projector, had become a destination for aviation professionals from across the country. On this particular morning, the flight attendant stood before a group of executives from various airlines and private aviation companies. The room was packed, with people even standing along the walls to hear her speak. Behind her, a screen displayed photos from the past 6 months, employees engaging with the VR training, candid shots of more diverse clients using their services, and statistics showing the dramatic improvements in customer satisfaction. "I'm not proud of how this story began," she told the audience, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "But I'm incredibly proud of how it's continuing." She clicked to the next slide, showing the company's new training statistics. In the past 6 months, over 50 companies have reached out to learn about our experience. The businessman sat quietly in the back of the room, watching with satisfaction. He hadn't planned to attend today's presentation, but his flight had been delayed due to weather, and something told him he should stay and watch. His original investment in providing the VR training for free had led to something far bigger than he'd imagined. "The numbers are important," the flight attendant continued, gesturing to the charts behind her. "Zero discrimination complaints in 6 months. Customer satisfaction up by 40%. Employee retention improved by 35%. She paused, looking around the room. But the real story isn't in these numbers. It's in the changes we see every day. She shared stories that brought the statistics to life. The elderly couple who wrote to thank them for their respectful service. The young tech entrepreneur who chose their company specifically because of their commitment to inclusive service. The group of international business leaders who became regular clients after hearing about their transformation. "But my favorite story," she said, her voice softening with emotion, "happened just last week." She described how a new employee had stopped a potentially discriminatory situation before it happened, stepping in to correct a colleague's assumptions about a client. The change isn't just in policies or procedures, it's in how we think and act every day. The businessman's phone buzzed with a message. His tech team had just received their 15th request this week for the VR training program. What had started as a free offering to one company had grown into a movement within the industry. Other sectors were starting to take notice too. Luxury retail, high-end hotels, exclusive restaurants. As the presentation concluded, the flight attendant shared one final thought. 6 months ago, I was the problem, she said honestly. Today, I'm part of the solution. And that's the most important lesson we've learned. Change is possible, not just in companies and policies, but in people's hearts and minds. The audience rose in a standing ovation. In the back of the room, the businessman quietly slipped out, a smile on his face. His delayed flight had given him the chance to see the full circle of what had happened that morning 6 months ago. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed small but significant changes. The way staff greeted everyone with the same respect, the diverse mix of clients moving through the space, the genuine warmth in every interaction. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Private jets took off and landed against this backdrop, carrying people from all walks of life to their destinations. The aviation industry, long seen as an exclusive club, was slowly but surely becoming something more, a place where everyone could feel welcome, respected, and valued.